It was just a wonderful script, but I had no idea that it was going to have the ongoing impact that it did until I got a note from the company that produced that show.
There's a reason certain stories refuse to stay buried. You can lock them away, scrub them from broadcast schedules, and pretend they never existed. But the truth has a way of crawling back into the light. The Twilight Zone, one of the most celebrated television series in American history, produced over 150 episodes across 5 seasons between 1959 and 1964. Most of them aired without incident. A handful became classics, but a select few were considered so inflammatory, so psychologically disturbing, or so legally radioactive that the people in charge of the airwaves simply made them disappear. Not just for a season, not just for a decade. Some of these episodes were gone for half a century, and at least one of them still carries a reputation so loaded that networks today remain hesitant to give it a regular broadcast home. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand the world Rod Serling was operating in. Television in the late 1950s was not a creative battlefield. It was a showroom. The major broadcast networks existed primarily as delivery vehicles for advertisers, and the corporations paying for commercial time had enormous influence over the content that aired around their products. There was an unspoken agreement between Hollywood and Madison Avenue. Keep the stories safe, keep the families happy, and never, under any circumstances, say anything that might cause a viewer to associate discomfort with the laundry detergent being sold in the next break. Racism, war crimes, mental illness, the dark underside of the American dream. These were subjects to be avoided, softened, or redirected entirely. Rod Serling refused to play by those rules, but he was smart enough to realize he couldn't fight them directly. He had already tried. Earlier in his career, he had written a powerful television drama inspired by the 1955 murder of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black teenager from Chicago who was brutally killed while visiting Mississippi. The response from network executives and sponsors was swift and merciless. They forced Serling to change the setting, remove all Southern references, and dilute the script until it bore almost no resemblance to the story he had intended to tell. The experience left him furious and determined to find a different way in. If realism was off limits, he would use fantasy. If direct confrontation was forbidden, he would use metaphor. He pitched a show built around science fiction, time travel, and the supernatural, subjects that sounded harmless enough to get past the gatekeepers, and then used that framework to smuggle in every uncomfortable truth the networks had been desperate to suppress. The Twilight Zone was born, and for several years it worked brilliantly. Then came the episodes that even the science fiction disguise could not protect. The first episode on this list is the one most often described as the most dangerous thing Rod Serling ever put on television. The encounter aired on May 1st, 1964, during the 5th and final season of the original series. It was set almost entirely within a single attic, a claustrophobic space that functioned less like a location and more like a pressure cooker. The story brought together 2 men, a white American World War II veteran named Fenton, played by Neville Brand, and a young Japanese-American man named Taro, played by then relatively unknown George Takei, years before he would become famous as Hikaru Sulu on Star Trek. Fenton is drinking alone in his attic when Taro comes looking for yard work. Fenton invites him upstairs, supposedly out of boredom or charity, but the atmosphere between the 2 men is immediately hostile. Sitting on a table nearby is a Japanese samurai sword that Fenton claims to have taken off an enemy soldier he killed in close combat during the war. As the conversation escalates, Serling does something that network television simply was not designed to handle. He forces both men to confess. Fenton eventually admits that he did not kill the soldier honorably in battle. He murdered a man who was already surrendering. Taro, meanwhile, is pushed to reveal that his own father was a Japanese spy who assisted in coordinating the attack on Pearl Harbor. The episode was asking American audiences to sit with 2 deeply uncomfortable ideas simultaneously: that American soldiers sometimes committed atrocities, and that Japanese Americans carried complicated histories that defied the simple narrative of loyal victim versus treacherous enemy. For 1964, this was not merely provocative. It was incendiary. Veterans organizations immediately condemned the portrayal of Fenton. Japanese American civil rights groups were deeply troubled by the implication that Japanese Americans bore some collective guilt for Pearl Harbor, a stereotype that had already been used to justify the internment of over 120,000 people during the war. The backlash came from opposite directions with equal force, and the network found itself in an impossible position. The solution was erasure. The encounter was pulled from all rerun packages and never broadcast again on American television for the next 50 years. It was not included in home video collections. It was not sold to local stations in syndication deals. For most of its existence after that single 1964 airing, the episode existed mainly as a rumor, something that older fans remembered seeing once and couldn't quite prove had happened. George Takei himself has spoken in interviews about his complicated feelings toward the episode, acknowledging both its bold intentions and the genuine harm caused by some of its more irresponsible plot choices. The episode resurfaced in limited forms in the digital age and has since been analyzed extensively by film scholars. But its reputation as television's most radioactive hour of drama remains largely intact. The second episode is a very different kind of story, and its disappearance had nothing to do with racial politics or wartime trauma. The miniature aired on February 21, 1963, during the fourth season, and it starred a young Robert Duvall in one of his earliest significant television roles, years before his film career would make him a household name. The episode tells the story of Charlie Parks, a socially withdrawn, painfully awkward man who struggles to function in the modern world. His co-workers mock him. His mother pressures him relentlessly about finding a wife and behaving normally. Every interaction he has with the outside world feels like an ambush. Then Charlie discovers a 19th century dollhouse on display in a local museum, and everything changes. Through the glass of the display case, he begins to see something impossible. A tiny, fully alive woman going about her daily life inside the miniature rooms. She plays the piano. She moves between spaces. She exists in a world that is quiet, ordered, and completely free from the chaos that makes Charlie's actual life unbearable. He becomes obsessed, returning to the museum day after day, bringing small gifts, speaking softly to the glass. The museum staff think he is having a breakdown. His family tries to have him committed. The ending is what made the episode genuinely legendary and genuinely disturbing. Charlie does not recover. He does not choose reality. Instead, he simply disappears, and when the guards look inside the display case, they find a tiny new figure sitting calmly on a sofa inside the dollhouse. Charlie found his way in. He chose the miniature world over the real one, and the episode frames this not as a tragedy, but as something closer to a peaceful resolution. For a 1963 audience raised on the idea that perseverance and community were the correct responses to hardship, the suggestion that retreat into fantasy might be a valid escape felt deeply wrong. But as unsettling as the content was, that is not why the episode disappeared. Shortly after it aired, a writer came forward claiming that the concept had been directly plagiarized from a story he had pitched to the network years earlier. The resulting copyright dispute was messy, prolonged, and expensive enough that the network decided the safest course of action was to simply remove the episode from circulation while the legal battle continued. The miniature was pulled from every rerun package, excluded from all syndication deals, and effectively frozen in place for nearly 2 decades. It was not until the 1980s that the legal situation was finally resolved and the episode could be seen again. In the meantime, it had become exactly the kind of ghost story it depicted, something people swore existed but could never quite find. The third episode on this list operates in a different register entirely, where the encounter was a slow-burn racial confrontation and the miniature was a melancholy fantasy. Sounds and Silences is a psychological horror story wearing the clothes of a dark comedy. It aired on April 3, 1964, also during the 5th season, and it follows a man named Roswell Flemington, a shipyard owner with a pathological relationship to noise. He cannot function without sound. He blasts music at all hours, shouts every sentence he speaks, and has driven away everyone who ever cared about him, including his wife, who finally leaves because she cannot endure the constant racket. To Flemington, volume is proof of existence. Silence, to him, is death. The universe responds to this obsession in the cruelest way imaginable. Without warning, Flemington's hearing becomes catastrophically hypersensitive. Ordinary sounds, a dripping faucet, a closing door, the ambient noise of a city street, register in his brain as physical explosions. He can barely function. He seeks medical help, and the treatment appears to work. But then the opposite problem takes over. He falls into complete and total silence. He cannot hear his own voice. He cannot hear his footsteps on the floor. He cannot hear his own heartbeat. For a man who built his entire identity around sound, this is not merely an inconvenience. It is the complete annihilation of self. The episode is a remarkably sharp piece of psychological writing, and it holds up surprisingly well today as an exploration of how identity can be constructed around sensory experience and what happens when that foundation collapses. But like the miniature, its disappearance from broadcast history had more to do with legal paperwork than artistic controversy. Shortly after the episode aired, a writer alleged that the core concept had been taken from a story he had written and submitted to the network previously. The lawsuit threat was enough. The episode was quietly removed from circulation and spent years as one of the more obscure entries in the Twilight Zone catalog, difficult to find, rarely discussed, and largely forgotten by casual audiences. What makes Sounds and Silences particularly interesting in retrospect is the layer of rumor that surrounded its production. People who worked on the set reportedly described an unusual atmosphere during filming, a tension that went beyond normal creative pressure, a sense that something about the production itself was off. Whether those stories reflect genuine events or simply grew up around the episode's mysterious disappearance is impossible to say with certainty. What is clear is that the combination of legal jeopardy and its deeply unsettling subject matter made it an easy episode to quietly lose. The 3 episodes described above were banned or buried for very different reasons. One was too honest about race and war. One was caught in a copyright dispute. One was both legally troubled and culturally uncomfortable. But what connects all 3 is the fact that they were asking questions the world was not ready to answer. Rod Serling understood something that the network executives around him consistently failed to grasp. Stories that make people deeply uncomfortable are not dangerous because they introduce new ideas. They are dangerous because they confirm things people already suspect, but have agreed not to say out loud. The forbidden nature of these episodes did not diminish them. It preserved them, because they were hidden away rather than worn smooth by decades of reruns and casual consumption. They retained a kind of sharp edge that most television from the same era has long since lost. When they finally became accessible again in the digital age, they did not feel like relics. They felt like warnings. Serling's anxiety about conformity, racial injustice, and the fragility of identity reads as clearly today as it did in 1964, which is either a testament to the quality of the writing or a fairly damning comment on how much has changed in the intervening decades. The networks that tried to erase these stories are gone or transformed beyond recognition. The sponsors who demanded safe content have been replaced by a media landscape where provocative content is not just permitted but actively marketed. And yet the episodes themselves continue to generate conversation, debate, and discomfort. That is probably exactly what Rod Serling intended. He was not making television for 1964. He was making it for anyone who would eventually be ready to watch it honestly. And judging by the ongoing fascination with these lost episodes, that audience is still growing.